The sun was setting over the rolling hills, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. The air smelled fresh, mixed with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine trees. Jake sat on his wooden porch, sipping a cup of coffee that had gone, lukewarm by now. He loved this place, his ranch cabin. It wasn't fancy or modern, but it was his. Every corner of the property carried memories of hard work, sweat, and sacrifice. It had taken him years to save up enough money for this retreat. A small piece of land where he could finally breathe without feeling the weight of city life pressing down on him. No honking cars, no crowded sidewalks, and most importantly, no unnecessary drama. Just him, nature, and the occasional deer wandering through the woods behind his cabin. Life here was simple, peaceful, and exactly what he needed. But tonight that peace felt fragile, like glass about to shatter. As Jake leaned back in his creaky chair, he noticed something unusual. A car was approaching along the dirt road leading to his driveway. At first glance, it looked ordinary, an SUV, shiny and clean, clearly not used to kicking up dust on rugged paths like these. But as the vehicle slowed down near the locked gate at the entrance of his property, Jake's stomach sank. He recognized the driver immediately. It was Karen. Now Karen wasn't just anyone. She was the type of person who thrived on control, always sticking her nose into other people's business. Around the neighborhood, she was known as HOA Karen, the self-appointed queen bee of the local homeowners association, HOA. If there was ever a tiny rule broken, like someone leaving their trash cans out one day too long or planting flowers that didn't match the approved color palette, Karen would swoop in, clipboard in hand, ready to lecture whoever crossed her path. Jake sighed deeply. Of all the days she could show up, why today, and why here? His cabin wasn't even part of the HOA jurisdiction. Technically, he lived outside their boundaries. Still, Karen had made it clear since day one that she saw him as some kind of outsider, someone who didn't belong. Over the past few months, she'd sent letters complaining about everything from the height of his grass to the way his mailbox tilted slightly to the left. It was exhausting, dealing with her constant nitpicking. As the SUV came to a stop, Jake squinted to get a better look. Karen wasn't alone. Two other people were sitting in the car with her. They climbed out awkwardly, dressed in clothes that screamed city slickers. One wore a blazer so perfectly pressed it looked like it had never been worn before. The siwa. Other adjusted his tie nervously, glancing around as if unsure how he'd ended up in such a remote location. Jake watched silently, gripping the edge of his chair tightly. What did they want? Why were they here? Karen stepped forward confidently, walking toward the gate. She rapped her knuckles against the metal bars, loud enough to echo across the quiet evening. "Jake," she called out, her voice sharp and commanding. "We need to talk." For a moment, Jake considered ignoring her. After all, she hadn't exactly earned the right to barge into his life whenever she pleased. But curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he stood up, brushing off his jeans as he walked down the steps of his porch. He stopped a few feet away from the gate, keeping a safe distance between them. "Evening," he said, his tone polite but firm. "What brings you all the way out here?" Karen smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, we've received some complaints about your setup here," she began, gesturing vaguely toward the cabin. Her gaze swept over the property, lingering on the stack of firewood near the shed and the old tractor parked beside the barn. "And as part of the HOA board, we're conducting an inspection." Jake raised an eyebrow. "An inspection? On my private land?" He folded his arms across his chest, standing his ground. "Last I checked, I don't live within the HOA's jurisdiction." Karen hesitated for a split second, caught off guard by his directness. But she quickly recovered, smoothing her expression into one of practiced authority. "Regardless, these are serious concerns, Jake. Your neighbors feel unsafe because of your ranch activities. We just want to ensure everything is up to code." Her two companions nodded enthusiastically behind her, though neither of them seemed particularly comfortable. The guy in the blazer kept fidgeting with his cuffs while the other man avoided making eye contact altogether. Clearly, they weren't thrilled to be tagging along on this little expedition. Jake's jaw tightened. "I didn't invite you onto my property, Karen, and unless you have a warrant, I suggest you leave." Karen's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. For a moment, she looked like she might argue further. Instead, she straightened her posture, clutching her clipboard tighter. "Fine," she snapped, "but don't say we didn't warn you." With that, she turned sharply on her heel and marched back to her car. The others followed suit, climbing into the SUV without another word. As they drove off, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake, Jake couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in his gut. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Jake woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest. The encounter with Karen and her entourage lingered in his mind like an unwelcome guest. He knew her type well, stubborn, entitled, and relentless. If she wanted something badly enough, she wouldn't stop until she got it. And judging by the way she'd shown up uninvited at his property, this wasn't just about nitpicking over mailbox colors or grass height anymore. This felt personal. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Jake replayed the events of the previous evening in his head. Her words echoed in his ears. "Your neighbors feel unsafe because of your ranch activities." What did that even mean? His ranch activities? Sure, he kept some tools and equipment around for maintenance, and yeah, he occasionally fired up the old tractor to clear brush from the back field. But none of that was dangerous, or illegal for that matter. It was just part of living on a rural property. Jake sighed and rubbed his temples. This wasn't going to go away on its own. Karen wasn't the kind of person who backed down easily. In fact, he suspected last night's visit was only the beginning of whatever plan she had brewing. She probably saw herself as some sort of crusader, protecting the neighborhood from chaos and disorder. But to Jake, she was nothing more than a bully trying to impose her will where it didn't belong. Determined not to let her ruin what he'd worked so hard to build, Jake decided it was time to take action. He couldn't rely on luck or hope that she'd lose interest. No, he needed to be prepared for anything. Fortifying the fortress. After finishing his coffee, Jake grabbed his work gloves and headed outside. First, he inspected the gate at the entrance of his driveway. It was sturdy enough, but the lock could use an upgrade. A few years ago, he'd installed a basic padlock, thinking it would be sufficient to keep curious passersby out. Now, he realized, it wouldn't hold up against someone determined to break in. He rummaged through the shed until he found a heavy-duty chain and a reinforced lock. With these additions, the gate would be much harder to tamper with. As he secured the new hardware in place, Jake felt a small sense of satisfaction. Let Karen try to force her way in now. She'd have a fight on her hands. Next, he turned his attention to lighting. One thing Jake had learned from years of living alone in remote areas was the importance of visibility. Darkness could either be your friend or your enemy, depending on how you used it. Right now, his property was too dark, at night, making it easy for unwanted visitors to sneak around unnoticed. That had to change. He drove into town and picked up a set of motion-activated floodlights. Back home, he climbed onto the roof of his cabin and mounted them strategically around the perimeter. Each light covered a wide area, ensuring no corner of his property would remain hidden in shadows. Once they were installed, he tested them one by one, watching as beams of bright white light illuminated the yard below. Perfect. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jake made one final preparation. From the depths of his storage shed, he pulled out an old generator he hadn't used in years. It wasn't much, but it would provide power if anyone tried cutting off his electricity. After refilling the fuel tank and giving it a test run, Jake dragged it inside the cabin and connected it to the main breaker, just in case. A night of waiting. By the time everything was ready, night had fully fallen. The world outside his windows was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves in the breeze. Jake locked the front door, double-checked the windows, and switched off all the interior lights. Then, armed with a flashlight and a steaming mug of tea, he settled into his favorite armchair near the window. From here, he had a perfect view of the driveway and the gate beyond. For hours, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Jake found himself growing restless, wondering if maybe he'd overreacted. Maybe Karen had decided to leave him alone after all. Maybe. Suddenly, the sound of tires crunching gravel snapped him out of his thoughts. Jake froze, his fingers tightening around the mug. Peering through the blinds, he saw headlights approaching slowly, 3 vehicles this time, an SUV and 2 trucks. They parked near the gate, their engines idling softly. Several figures climbed out, carrying flashlights and what looked like tools. Jake's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. He watched silently as Karen stepped forward, leading the group. She pointed toward the gate, gesturing for one of the men to bring out a pair of bolt cutters. For a moment, Jake considered stepping outside to confront them directly, but then he remembered the floodlights. With a flick of a switch, the entire front yard erupted in blinding light. The sudden brightness startled everyone, sending them stumbling backward. Some dropped their flashlights while others shielded their eyes with their hands. Jake stood up, walked to the door, and shouted, "You're trespassing. Leave now or I'm calling the sheriff." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then Karen stepped forward, squinting into the glare. Even from a distance, Jake could see the frustration etched across her face. "This isn't over," she yelled, her voice sharp and defiant. "You'll regret this." Without another word, she motioned for her group to retreat. They scrambled back to their vehicles, slamming doors and revving engines as they sped away. Jake watched them disappear down the dirt road, the red glow of their taillights fading into the darkness. Reflections under the stars. Once the immediate threat had passed, Jake sank back into his chair, letting out a shaky breath. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, leaving him jittery and wired. He knew tonight's confrontation was far from the end of this mess. Karen wouldn't give up so easily. She'd come back, angrier and more determined than ever. But for now, he'd won this round. Stepping outside, Jake gazed up at the star-filled sky. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine. Despite everything, he felt a strange sense of peace. His ranch cabin wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of freedom, a place where he could live life on his own terms. And no amount of bullying or intimidation from someone like Karen was going to take that away from him. As he stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the generator and the distant call of crickets, Jake resolved to protect his sanctuary no matter what. Whatever came next, he'd face it head on. The days following the late-night confrontation at the gate passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Jake tried to go about his routine, fixing fences, chopping firewood, tending to the small vegetable garden he'd started, but it was hard to focus. Every creak of the floorboards inside the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, made him glance over his shoulder. He couldn't shake the feeling that Karen and her crew were lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting for their next move. Despite the tension hanging in the air, Jake refused to let fear take hold. Instead, he channeled his energy into staying prepared. He spent hours reinforcing weak spots around the property, tightening hinges on doors, and clearing brush that might provide cover for anyone sneaking around. The generator hummed steadily, in the background a reassuring reminder that he had backup power if needed. And those motion-activated floodlights? They worked like a charm, lighting up the yard brighter than daylight whenever a raccoon or stray deer wandered too close. Still, no matter how many precautions he took, Jake knew this wasn't just about physical security anymore. This was personal. Now, Karen wasn't just some nosy neighbor poking her nose where it didn't belong. She was determined to make his life miserable. Her actions felt less like concern for community standards and more like a vendetta. What had he ever done to deserve this kind of treatment? All he wanted was to live quietly away from drama and conflict, but Karen seemed hell-bent on dragging him into both. A letter arrives. One afternoon, as Jake was hauling firewood from the shed to stack by the cabin, he noticed something unusual tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck. It was An envelope, crisp and white, standing out starkly against the dusty glass. His stomach sank as he pulled it free and opened it. Inside was a formal letter, not handwritten, but printed neatly on official-looking paper, with the HOA logo emblazoned across the top. The tone of the letter was icy and accusatory. According to Karen's team, Jake's property posed numerous violations: unauthorized structures, his shed, improper waste disposal, a pile of branches he'd been meaning to burn, and even noise complaints from neighbors who lived miles away. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat. Unless he addressed these issues within 7 days, legal action would follow. Jake crumpled the paper in his fist, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Legal action? For what? Living on his own land, he hadn't broken any laws. He'd double-checked the zoning regulations when he bought the place. This was nothing more than intimidation tactics, pure and simple. Karen was trying to strong-arm him into compliance, hoping he'd buckle under pressure. But Jake wasn't the type to back down easily. If anything, the letter only strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't let her win, not this time. Friends and allies. That evening, Jake decided to reach out to someone who might understand his situation better than most. Tom, an older guy who lived a few miles down the road. Tom had lived in the area for decades and knew all the ins and outs of dealing with difficult neighbors. More importantly, he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. When Jake showed up at Tom's house, the older man was sitting on his porch whittling a piece of wood. Without hesitation, Jake explained everything: the uninvited visits, the floodlights, the letter from the HOA. Tom listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little until Jake finished. "Well," Tom said finally, setting the knife and wood aside. "Karen's always been trouble. She thinks she runs this whole county, but she doesn't. You're smart to stand your ground." Tom went on to share stories of his own run-ins with Karen over the years, how she'd once reported him for having a rusty tractor parked in his yard. "It's called character," Tom had told the sheriff, and another time accused him of disturbing the peace because his rooster crowed early in the morning. Each story ended the same way. Tom stood firm, and eventually Karen moved on to harass someone else. "She feeds off attention," Tom said, leaning forward. "Once she realizes you're not going to play her game, she'll lose interest. Just don't give her ammunition." Jake nodded thoughtfully. Talking to Tom helped put things into perspective. Yes, Karen was persistent, but she wasn't invincible. With patience and strategy, he could outlast her. Preparation meets opportunity. Over the next few days, Jake threw himself into fortifying his defenses even further. He added barbed wire along the top of the fence surrounding his property, not because he expected anyone to climb it, but because the sight alone might deter troublemakers. He also installed a cheap wireless camera system, positioning the cameras near the gate and other key areas. If Karen came back, he'd have proof of her antics, and maybe even catch her doing something illegal. To keep himself busy, Jake focused on projects around the cabin. He repaired the old tractor, which had been sitting unused for months, and used it to clear out a patch of land behind the barn. By the end of the week, he'd transformed the space into a makeshift obstacle course, complete with wooden ramps and tires buried halfway into the ground. It wasn't just practical, it gave him a sense of accomplishment, a reminder that he was still in control of his life. On the 7th day, the deadline mentioned in Karen's letter, Jake woke up bracing for impact. He half expected to see squad, cars pulling up his driveway or a process server knocking on his door. But as the hours ticked by, nothing happened. No visitors, no letters, no calls from lawyers, just silence. A moment of calm. By nightfall, Jake allowed himself to relax. For the first time in weeks, he actually slept soundly. When he woke up the next morning, the sun streaming through the windows felt warmer somehow, less harsh. He stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air, and surveyed his property. Everything looked the same as it always had, yet it felt different. Stronger. Safer. Jake realized something important during those quiet moments. Karen's threats weren't just about rules or regulations. They were about power. She thrived on making people feel small, powerless and desperate. But Jake had turned the tables. He'd taken her attempts to intimidate him and used them to strengthen his resolve. His ranch cabin wasn't just a home anymore. It was a fortress, built not just of wood and stone, but of determination and grit. As he sipped his coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jake smiled. Whatever came next, he was ready. The calm that followed the deadline mentioned in Karen's letter didn't last long. Jake had hoped, maybe even naively believed, that she would back off after her threats went unanswered. But Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. If anything. Silence only fueled her determination, and Jake was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. It started with small things that seemed harmless at first, but quickly added up. One morning, as Jake drove into town to pick up supplies, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through his field. At first glance, they looked like the kind left by heavy machinery, deep grooves slicing through the soft earth. Someone had driven across his property without permission, tearing up sections of land he'd spent months clearing and leveling. Jake clenched his jaw as he surveyed the damage. The tracks led straight from the edge of his driveway to the far corner of the field, where a large patch of soil was now churned into mud. Whoever did this hadn't just trespassed, they'd done it deliberately, leaving behind a mess that would take days to fix. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was responsible. Later that week, another incident occurred. Jake returned home late one evening to find his mailbox smashed to pieces, lying in shards on the ground. A rock the size of a baseball sat nearby, evidence of what, or rather who, had caused the destruction. He stared at the wreckage for a long moment before shaking his head and heading inside. Replacing the mailbox wouldn't be difficult, but the message was clear. Karen was escalating. Then came the noise complaints, or more accurately, the fake noise complaints. Jake received calls from the local sheriff's department, not once, but twice, informing him that neighbors had reported loud disturbances coming from his property. Both times, deputies showed up unannounced, searching for signs of rowdy parties or illegal activity. Of course, they found nothing except Jake sitting quietly on his porch enjoying the sunset. Still, the repeated visits were unsettling. Each time, Jake felt like he was being watched, judged, scrutinized. Karen's tactics weren't subtle anymore. She wasn't hiding behind formal letters or clipboard-wielding inspections. This was personal now, and she wanted him to know it. Determined to catch her red-handed, Jake decided to put his newly installed cameras to good use. Every night he reviewed the footage, scanning for anything unusual. For days there was nothing, just deer wandering through the woods and the occasional delivery truck driving past. Then one evening, he spotted something that made his blood boil. The video showed Karen's SUV pulling up to the gate again, this time with two other vehicles trailing behind. They parked near the entrance and turned off their headlights, blending into the darkness. From the grainy footage, Jake could see several figures stepping out carrying tools and flashlights. One of them, a man wearing a hoodie, was dragging a large bag over his shoulder. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't friendly. Jake fast-forwarded through the recording, watching as the group approached the gate. They tried prying it open with crowbars, then moved on to using bolt cutters when that failed. After several minutes of fruitless effort, they gave up and retreated to their cars. Before leaving, however, one of them hurled something toward the camera. A rock aimed squarely at the lens. The screen went black. Jake sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the arms tightly. So this was how low they were willing to stoop. Vandalism, intimidation, breaking and entering attempts. Karen wasn't playing fair, but Jake hadn't expected her to. What surprised him was the level of coordination involved. Clearly she'd recruited help, people willing to follow her lead no matter how reckless or unethical her plans became. Feeling overwhelmed, Jake reached out to Tom again. This time he brought along screenshots of the security footage, showing exactly what Karen and her crew had been up to. Tom studied the images carefully, his expression growing darker with each frame. "She's crossing lines," Tom said finally, handing the phone back to Jake. "This isn't just harassment anymore, it's criminal behavior." Jake nodded grimly. "I know, but what do I do? Call the cops?" They already think I'm some troublemaker thanks to her fake complaints. Tom leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. You need proof. Hard evidence that ties her directly to these incidents. Without it, you're just shouting into the wind. Jake frowned. How am I supposed to get that? Tom grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. Leave that part to me. Over the next few days, Tom helped Jake set up additional cameras around the property, positioning them in places where they'd be less obvious but still effective. Together, they rigged a few decoys, cheap plastic cameras designed to look real, to make Karen's crew think twice before acting. Finally, Tom suggested Jake start documenting everything, every interaction, every incident, every piece of evidence he gathered. Paper trails matter, Tom explained. If this goes to court, you'll need more than just your word. A few nights later, Jake's preparations paid off. As usual, he reviewed the footage from the cameras, scrolling through hours of empty fields and quiet roads. Then around midnight, movement caught his eye. Karen's SUV appeared on screen, followed closely by the same two trucks he'd seen before. The group got out of their vehicles and headed straight for the gate, flashlights cutting through the darkness. But this time, they weren't alone. There was a fourth person with them, a woman Jake didn't recognize. She carried a clipboard and wore a badge clipped to her jacket. Jake squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was she a lawyer? A code enforcement officer? Either way, Karen had clearly brought reinforcements. The group spent nearly an hour attempting to breach the gate, using everything from bolt cutters to drills. When none of their efforts worked, frustration boiled over. Voices rose, sharply, muffled but audible even through the camera's microphone. Jake couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, desperation, and a hint of panic. Finally, Karen stepped forward, pointing emphatically at the gate. Her body language screamed authority, as if she were giving orders. Moments later, the hooded man from the previous video reappeared, holding something bulky in his hands. Jake's stomach dropped as he realized what it was: a can of spray paint. Within seconds, bright red graffiti covered the gate, spelling out a single word: liar. Jake paused the video, his heart pounding. This was it, the smoking gun he'd been waiting for. Not only had Karen orchestrated the vandalism, but she'd also recorded herself doing it. Whether she intended to or not, she'd handed Jake all the ammunition he needed to fight back. With the new evidence in hand, Jake called Tom immediately. I've got her, he said, his voice trembling with a mix of relief and triumph. She messed up big time. Tom chuckled. Good. Now we hit her where it hurts. Together, they drafted a detailed report, attaching screenshots from the security footage and timestamps to prove the timeline of events. Jake sent copies to the local sheriff's department, the county zoning board, and even the media. He knew going public might invite unwanted attention, but at this point, he didn't care. Karen had pushed him too far, and it was time to expose her for who she really was. As Jake waited for the authorities to respond, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. No matter what happened next, he'd taken control of the situation. Karen might have thought she held all the cards, but Jake had proven her wrong. His ranch cabin wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of resilience, standing strong against anyone who dared challenge it. And Jake wasn't backing down anytime soon. The days after Jake submitted his evidence to the authorities were tense, filled with a mix of anticipation and unease. He knew he'd done everything right, documenting each incident, gathering irrefutable proof, and presenting it all in a way that left little room for doubt. But justice isn't always swift, especially when dealing with bureaucracy. So while he waited for the wheels to turn, Jake kept himself busy, channeling his energy into fixing what Karen and her crew had damaged. First, he tackled the gate. The bright red graffiti glaring across the metal was like a scar on his property, oh woo, constant reminder of the lengths Karen had gone to ruin his peace. Armed with sandpaper, paint thinner, and a fresh coat of black paint, Jake spent hours scrubbing away the vandalism. It wasn't easy. The spray paint had dried unevenly, leaving stubborn streaks that resisted every attempt to remove them. But Jake didn't stop until the gate looked as good as new, or at least close enough. Next, he turned his attention to the field where the tire tracks had torn up the soil. Clearing and leveling the land had been a labor of love, something he'd worked on for months before Karen's interference. Now, he had to start over. Using the old tractor, he plowed through the churned-up earth, breaking apart clumps of mud and smoothing out the surface. It was back-breaking work, but there was a strange satisfaction in reclaiming what was his. With each pass of the tractor, Jake felt a little more in control, a little less like a victim. Finally, he replaced the mailbox. The smashed remains still lay scattered by the side of the road, so Jake dragged them to the shed and hauled out an old wooden post he'd salvaged from another project. He mounted a simple metal box on top and painted it dark green to match the cabin. As he hammered the last nail into place, Jake stepped back and admired his handiwork. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy, and most importantly, it stood tall despite everything Karen had thrown at him. About a week later, the sheriff's department finally reached out. A deputy arrived one afternoon, accompanied by someone from the county zoning board. They asked Jake to walk them through the incidents, showing them the repaired gate, the damaged field, and the security camera footage. Jake explained everything calmly, pointing out key moments in the videos and handing over copies of his report. To his relief, both officials seemed genuinely concerned. The deputy frowned deeply as he watched the clip of Karen directing her crew to vandalize the gate. "This is serious," he said, shaking his head. "We'll need to look into this further." A few days later, Jake received word that Karen and two others involved in the trespassing and vandalism had been formally questioned. While no arrests were made immediately, the investigation cast a long shadow over Karen's reputation. Rumors spread quickly in small towns, and soon everyone knew about her late-night escapades and attempts to intimidate Jake. For someone who prided herself on being a pillar of the community, the backlash was brutal. It didn't take long for Karen to realize she'd bitten off more than she could chew. Once the story hit local news outlets, complete with screenshots of the security footage, public opinion turned sharply against her. Neighbors who had once tolerated, or even supported, her antics began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with her increasingly reckless behavior. Even members of the HOA board started questioning her leadership, calling for an emergency meeting to discuss her conduct. Jake noticed the change almost immediately. The calls and letters stopped coming. The suspicious vehicles no longer lingered near his driveway. And though Karen occasionally drove past his property, she never slowed down or made eye contact. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, not the towering figure of authority she'd once pretended to be. For Jake, it was a quiet victory. He hadn't set out to destroy Karen's life. He just wanted her to leave him alone. Now it seemed she'd gotten the message loud and clear. As the weeks passed, life on the ranch settled into its usual rhythm. The tension that had weighed so heavily on Jake's shoulders began to lift, replaced by a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months. He spent his days working on projects around the cabin, enjoying the solitude and simplicity of rural living. At night, he sat on the porch, watching the stars twinkle above the hills. The generator hummed softly in the background, a comforting reminder of how far he'd come since those first stressful encounters with Karen. One evening, as Jake sipped coffee under the glow of the porch light, Tom stopped by for a visit. "Heard, things have calmed down around here," Tom said, settling into a chair beside him. "How you holding up?" Jake smiled faintly. "Better. Feels like I can breathe again." Tom nodded approvingly. "Good. You handled yourself well, you know. Most folks would have cracked under that kind of pressure. But not you." Jake shrugged modestly. "I just wanted to protect what's mine, that's all." Tom chuckled. "And you did. Better than anyone expected." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the crickets chirp and the distant hoot of an owl. After a moment, Tom spoke again. "You know, people talk. They see what you've built here, how you stood your ground. Some might say you're inspiring." Jake laughed softly. "I don't know about that. I'm just glad it's over." Later that night, after Tom had gone home, Jake stayed outside a little longer, staring up at the vast expanse of sky. The stars stretched endlessly above him, tiny pinpricks of light against the darkness. There was something humbling about their vastness, a reminder of how small human conflicts really were in the grand scheme of things. He thought about everything he'd been through, the sleepless nights, the frustration, the fear. It had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to dig deep and find strength he didn't know he had. But it had also taught him something important. Resilience wasn't about never feeling afraid or overwhelmed. It was about keeping going anyway, even when the odds felt stacked against you. His ranch cabin wasn't perfect. There were still repairs to make, fences to mend, and fields to tend. But it was his. Every scratch on the gate, every dent in the mailbox told a story of survival and perseverance. And for Jake, that made it worth every ounce of effort. As he headed inside, locking the door behind him, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude for the land beneath his feet, for the friends who'd stood by him, and for the lessons he'd learned along the way. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he could face them. Because sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting your property, it's about finding peace within yourself.